Hi friends, it's Kayla. I get suggested to do this video frequently, and I'm not quite sure how to do it, but I'm gonna figure it out with you. And that is my audiobook recommendations. So I'm going to give you 20 audiobooks that I recommend, but essentially I'm just recommending the book itself because all the books that came to mind were like 4 and 5 star reads. So I'm not just recommending the audiobook because it's great, but the book itself is something that I would recommend. I think I struggle with the concept because the majority of books I read aren't audiobooks. So like, I'm sure there are so many books that I love that also have great audiobooks. I just didn't read them that way. I'm going to start with just a couple thriller recommendations because I don't tend to listen to thrillers as audiobooks, but these are a couple that I have and I enjoyed. So I have The One by John Mars, which I just recently listened to. My preference for audiobooks, I guess, is a full cast. I will always love an audiobook more if it has multiple voice actors when warranted. Obviously, this has a bunch of different perspectives because we're following this discovery, this DNA thing that matches you with your perfect soulmate, basically the person you're supposed to be with. I'm going to find them all on Scribd. There isn't one audiobook service that I recommend over others. I would check out Audible, Scribd, whatever ones work through your library. I think they all have different benefits. So if you have any other services you like, tell me down below. I'm going to play a little clip of each one just on regular speed, even though I would normally listen to an audiobook on 1.8 or 2, depending on the style.
Thank you for choosing Match Your DNA. The world's first scientifically proven test, 100% guaranteed to match you with the one and only person you're genetically designed to fall in love with.
There you go. Was that helpful? Oh my god. I think I like this one specifically because it does have that full cast and there are so many perspectives, and sometimes it can get a little confusing maybe if you're just reading it with your eyeballs. My next one is If We're Villains by M.L. Rio. This follows a man, so it's got one narrator. He's just getting out of jail and his lawyer is finding out the truth about like what really went down all those years ago with this group of friends at a Shakespeare school and the truth about a tragic event. So this is his story.
Act 1. I sit with my wrists cuffed to the table and I think, but that I am forbid to tell the secrets of my prison house, I could a tale unfold whose lightest word would harrow up thy soul.
So you kind of already get a feel for the dramatic way that this is told. And there's a lot of like Shakespeare plays in here, like people performing and dialogue and scene instruction. And I think that just made it really enjoyable to listen to rather than like read portions of a play. It's really cool to actually listen to it like a performance. So that's why I really like this one. I'm sure there are so many great thriller audiobooks, so I would love if you could recommend some down below. For me, my preference for audiobooks is usually nonfiction and fantasy because I like being told a story. I feel like it's easier to get into when I hear it told like a fairy tale to me, like a bedtime story. And for nonfiction, I just like hearing someone's authentic story from them. So that's why you'll see very few thrillers or contemporary on this list, because I just don't tend to listen to them unless I've heard something really good about the audiobook. So the next two I have are kind of mystery thriller-ish, but they're more just intense contemporary, I would say. These two are YA. Of course, I'm going to mention Sadie by Courtney Summers. This is one of the first times I heard an audiobook so recommended. Obviously, book 2, we're always recommending books, but I haven't heard an audiobook specifically mentioned that many times until people started talking about Sadie, and I completely agree. The Macmillan audiobook team is just doing some really cool things. So in this story, we're following a girl named Sadie, and she is trying to track down the murderer of her younger sister. And we're also listening to a podcast following Sadie's journey. So again, we have a full cast. There are lots of people in here. There's dramatic music, there's sound effects. It's like a full production. And if you didn't know, if you've never listened to an audiobook before, you can actually, I don't think Scribd does this. You don't really need to because you kind of have access to a lot. But on Audible, you can listen to a sample of any book to see if you like, you know, the narrator and the vibe of it, because there are definitely narrators that I don't really like connect with and don't want to listen to for 5+ hours.
It's a beautiful day in the city. The sun is shining, not a cloud in the sky. I had a great lunch in Central Park. Chicken shawarma from the shawarma stop, which was overwhelmingly recommended to us by our listeners after last week's episode on NYC's Best Kept Secrets. Thanks for that, you guys.
So the cool thing about this is because there's a podcast as part of the actual story, it's cool to listen to the podcast. I love books about podcasts. I've made a specific video recommending a bunch of books that include podcasts, and I've tried out a lot of the audiobooks, and they don't sound like podcasts. They're just being read like any other book would be read. But this one specifically sounds like a podcast, which made me love it so much. Next up, I have Monday's Not Coming by Tiffany D. Jackson. This is a story about a girl whose best friend Monday has gone missing. And no one really seems that concerned about her. And so, I think her name was Claudia. She is trying to track down her friend and find out what happened to her. The audiobook I recommend really because the narrator is so wonderful.
Performed by Imani Parks.
Imani Parks.
This is the story of how my best friend disappeared. How nobody noticed she was gone except me. And how nobody cared until they found her 1 year later. I know what you're thinking. How can a whole person, a kid, disappear and no one say a word?
This, along with like every other book that I'm mentioning, I love on its own. I love the story, obviously, so I just recommend the book in general. But if you're planning on reading it, highly recommend the audiobook. There's a couple other reasons I will pick up a contemporary as an audiobook, and that's if there is some type of performative element to it. So, like on The Come Up by Angie Thomas, there is rapping in here. In this book, we follow Bree, who wants to be a performer. She wants to rap for a living, and she gets the opportunity to have some attention put on her, but in not the best circumstances. She's getting a lot of hate online, and she needs to kind of combat that. And it's her like dealing with maybe getting a record deal and opportunity and doing the right thing with fame. So the audiobook, it's not performed like with music or anything, but it's kind of like slam poetry. It's performed, which I really like.
Run up on me and get done up. Whole squad got more heat than a furnace. Silencer is a must, they ain't heard us. We don't bust yet, they blame us for murder. You think I'm a thug? Well, I claim it. This Glock, yeah, I cock it and aim it.
As somebody who has been vocal about the fact that I always find it cheesy reading lyrics or poetry within text. Like I can't read it in a way that doesn't sound dorky. I really appreciate audiobooks that have that type of performance because it's so much more authentic what the author intended than what I can come up with in my head. Bonnie Turpin is the narrator of this, and this is the first time that I listened to an audiobook, and I really enjoyed the narrator enough to think like I would like to pick up other books narrated by her. My next one is also a narrator that I fell in love with, and I have two examples here. This is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. She actually narrates her own audiobook, and it's one of the best ones I've ever listened to. Again, it has the performative aspect because she does slam poetry, as well as a character named Ziomara, and she is just getting into slam poetry in this book. There's definitely a lot more to the plot than just that. She's grappling with faith and her family and falling in love and her body, and it's just one of the best audiobooks I've listened to because I love her voice so much. The whole thing is kind of written in verse, so there are definitely books that like you might have a preference for. If you feel like it's important to see the words, like that's a really impactful experience for you, or if listening to it is better. But I'll skip to a part that you can get a real feel for what she's doing.
At lunch, I sit with the same group I sat with last year, a table full of girls that want to be left alone. I find comfort in apples and my journal as the other girls read books over their lunch trays or draw manga or silently text boyfriends, sharing space but not words.
I really just love the cadence of her voice, and it's just one of my favorite things to listen to. So highly recommend the book and the audiobook. And then she also narrated Pride by E.B. Zaboy, which is another book I love so much. It's a Pride and Prejudice remix, as it says. This is a story of Zuri and Darius, and they're living in Brooklyn. One of them is new to their neighborhood, and it's about gentrification and their romance, and also the main character and her ambition in life and where she wants to go. And I just love the choice of Elizabeth Acevedo narrating it as well. For some of these books, I didn't listen to the entire audiobook. Like, I go back and forth between reading it with my eyes and my ears, or in some cases I just listen to a little bit of the beginning until I get into it, and then I start reading physically.
It's a truth universally acknowledged that when rich people move into the hood, where it's a little bit broken and a little bit forgotten, the first thing they want to do is clean it up. But it's not just the junky stuff they'll get rid of. People can be thrown away too.
Now we'll get into my favorite thing to listen to via audio, and that's some type of fantasy, or just like speculative in some way. It could be magical realism, could be post-apocalyptic. I really enjoy listening to audiobooks that have a narrator with a unique voice or an accent or something like that. So I really love listening to Indigenous or First Nations narrated audiobooks, written and narrated. So like Moon of the Crusted Snow by Wabgeshig Rice. I feel like getting to listen to someone describe it just helps you get the vibe for the storytelling and the setting even more. So in this story, we're following an Anishinaabe community, and the power has gone out. So this isn't quite fantasy, but it's like that weird vibe, because it's post-apocalyptic, where the world is just slowly losing civilization or people or power or just the society that they used to have. Also, when there is a book that has a lot of words or language that you are unfamiliar with, I think listening to the audiobook is great, because you don't have to stumble over words. It just gets told to you, and you know, add some pronunciations to your vocabulary. It's always good.
Evan Whitesky stood and looped his rifle around his right shoulder, adjusted his neon orange hat, and began a slow walk over to his kill. The smell of gunpowder briefly dominated the crisp scent of impending winter.
These two are books that I would recommend listening to just at regular speed, because the slow nature of the storytelling is kind of important for the overall tone, I would say, especially with the next one, Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. This is a story that's really hard to explain. It's about a young girl. It's heavily reliant on metaphor and animals and spirits and her connection with nature. She gets pregnant. She has to navigate this along with other people in her life. It's told in a really unique way, and I listened to this and then read the entire thing as well. I think both ways are really powerful, but this is one of the most jarring audiobooks I've ever listened to. I don't even know how to describe it. Hopefully the sample here will give you a good idea.
I wonder why nobody kicks him out. Things are better at home now. Three's Company and a calm air. Archie comics and Lego. Good night. Smells unleashed from the spring thaw lift us into a frenzied desperation for movement.
I know it's definitely not for everyone, but this is a really intense book. It's graphic and uncomfortable, and the audiobook is just like that perfect, the tone matches exactly, and she's the narrator of it. She's mostly known for her music, so her narrating is just really special and impactful, and if it's your thing, you'll love it. But it's unique. Next up is The Afterlife of Holly Chase by Cynthia Hand. I always love Cynthia Hand's audiobooks. This one's narrated by Erin Spencer, and I just think she did a really lovely job. We're following Holly Chase, who in this kind of retelling or inspired by story, she's involved in Project Scrooge, where she goes and participates in visiting bad people and being like the ghost of Christmas past, future, and present. And it's just a really fun read, however you decide to enjoy it.
$20 says the kid actually speaks the words, said Marty. No way, said Grant. Why don't you put your money where your mouth is, Big Shot? Grant pulled out his wallet. You're on, but it has to be the exact words.
There's definitely audiobooks that don't need a full cast because the other characters aren't prominent enough to need voice actors. So it's great when the one person narrating does a fine enough job of changing their voice so you know that other people are speaking. I just really love Erin Spencer's narration. I'm really not all that familiar with the audiobook world, so I can't tell you like who I think the best narrators are or what you should be looking for, but narrating audiobooks is something I would really like to look into in the future, just trying sometime, just for fun. The next one I have is Blanca y Roja by Anna Marie McLemore. This book is wonderful, as are all of their books. It's kind of a retelling of Swan Lake. I think I've listened to every Anna Marie McLemore at least a little bit as an audiobook because I always really enjoy myself. And this one I think I enjoyed the most because it has a full cast. I think we have 4 different narrators because we have 4 perspectives in here. There's 2 sisters who have this curse on the family that one day they'll have to like fight to the death, and one of them will become a swan. And then we have 2 kind of love interest characters.
Everyone has their own way of telling our story. Some say it began generations ago, with a girl lured by the white birds in the woods. The moment she reached out a small hand toward their wind-fluffed feathers, a swan bit her.
Next up is the Wayward Children series. Now, I need to preface that I've only actually listened to one of these as an audiobook, but I really want to recommend that one specifically because Sean McGuire narrates it herself. This is the Wayward Children series. It's following Eleanor West and her school for wayward children. They all, in every different novella, there is a child we're following who goes into a magical world. Some of the books take place in that magical world. Some of them take place after the fact, after they've come back to the real world and can't cope and want to go back to their magical land but can't. And this school and the people in it help them just get back into, you know, their daily lives. I've only ever listened to Come Tumbling Down, but it was so great listening to Shauna McGuire narrate it herself. And I think she also narrates this one, which is cool because these actually follow like the same characters.
It had been a modest 3-story home once upon a renovation, but it had been embellished over the course of generations by widows and widowers
who had handled their grief and their inheritance in the same manner, by picking up a hammer and setting to work.
Next up, I've got another book narrated by the author themselves, which is really cool. This one is special too because it's kind of a memoir, and that's Black Girl Unlimited by Echo Brown. I listened to a couple of these really recently, so you've probably heard me talk about a few of the books in this video. But this is one of the most unique stories I've ever read, and I think listening to it is really cool because it's so unique that being told the story helps you get into it even more, because I feel like it's a little confusing exactly what genre this fits into. It says part memoir, part magic. Black Girl Unlimited is a transcendent coming of age story and an unforgettable debut. So it's got like magic elements. We're following a wizard, but it's more metaphor, and it's dealing with so many intense topics, from racism to addiction to poverty, and it's following her dealing with all of these things and coming out the other side an incredible person and finding new opportunities. And it's a really hope-filled, like, beautiful and difficult story full of like escapism.
When Mrs. Jackson Randolph isn't looking, we pass candy and make funny faces at each other. Sometimes we even cover our ears and scream at the top of our lungs.
And then before I get into some nonfiction recommendations, I just have to mention Little Women, because I've listened to an audiobook for this twice in the last month, and then read it physically once in the last month, and my whole brand is just a Little Women stan now. I love it so much. And as I continue to read a couple more classics this year, more than I probably ever have, I think audiobooks are kind of the way to go, especially when first getting into it, because the language is naturally just gonna be unfamiliar. This was written in the 1860s, and it's just a different way of speaking, and the audiobook was great. This is family, the March family. We have 4 sisters, Jo, Amy, Beth, and Meg, and just their experience in life. I keep mentioning that I love the audiobook of this, and people keep asking me, and I'm responding to as many comments as I can, which one I first listened to, and that is the one by Catherine O'Brien. I'll try to show you here just like what it looks like on Scribd. I thought it was told really well. And then the second time I listened to it, I listened to the one that you all recommended with Laura Dern as one of the narrators, and that one has a full cast with a whole bunch of other people, and I liked that one equally. So I've learned, I think it's just the story itself, maybe not the audiobook, that's incredible. But if you're like hesitant to go into this, highly recommend the audiobook because it's such a beautiful story to listen to.
It's so dreadful to be poor, sighed Meg, looking down at her old dress. I don't think it's fair for some girls to have plenty of pretty things and other girls nothing at all.
Okay, now nonfiction. The first one is really funny because I love the audiobook of it so much, and I feel like I've recommended it a million times. And I'm pretty sure in recommending it, I said that the author narrates it, which is a lie. This is Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. The audiobook is narrated by another 3-name human starting with Jonathan, and I maybe just like wasn't paying attention when the audiobook started, and I was like, oh, it's Jonathan Safran Foer. No, it's Jonathan Todd Ross, who I think told this story incredibly. And so it's not a story, it's just like a thought process about eating animals. Told it so well and authentically that I was so sure it was the author. This is a book that just discusses like veganism, vegetarianism, and not in a way that's like trying to influence you. It's really just a fact-based text and makes you think about so many things beyond just like, should we eat animals?
I frequently found myself confused. Sometimes this disorientation was the result of the slipperiness of terms like suffering, joy, and cruelty. Sometimes it seemed to be a deliberate effect.
The next one I have is one of my all-time favorite nonfictions, which is Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher. He himself narrates the audiobook, which is amazing. I always love listening to mountain climbing expedition stories via audio. And this one isn't his own story. He's telling someone else's story. The Dyatlov Pass incident was this thing that happened where this entire group of mountain climbers died in Russia. It happened in 1959, and there have been so many theories about what happened to these hikers, how they died, so many conspiracy theories. You can even watch conspiracy theories on YouTube about it. And Donnie Eicher is chronicling his experience finding out the truth, interviewing people, going to Russia, going to the location, discovering all of these things about the incident, and then telling the story that he thinks he discovered, like what actually happened, and then he tells the event like firsthand, kind of like this is what happened in the moments leading up to all of the deaths. It's a really intense thing to listen to and so well told. Just like I said, it's like watching a documentary, getting to listen to someone tell a story like this.
Two figures trudge across a snowy expanse. The peak of Otartan Mountain stands icy and grim in the distance, a lone witness to their miserable progress. It is afternoon, though difficult to say how late.
Okay, I immediately want to listen to this again. It's just, if you have the talents to portray this ominous story, it's just like, please do it. It's great. I also recommend Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer, The Climb by Anatoly Bukhriev. Great nonfiction accounts of climbing. It's just something I love for some reason. Next up in my nonfiction stack is How We Did It by Carl Subban. He is the father of a bunch of NHL players like PK Subban, and he tells the story of his childhood in Jamaica, moving to Canada, having children, and like how he thinks you should raise children and why he has such successful children. And again, I think it's just hearing someone's personal account is really powerful. He also just has a really enjoyable voice. This one is, I remember, a pretty slow one, so I would recommend speeding it up if you like that.
His most famous hockey dad, the one who told his son not to skate to where the puck was, but to where it was going. I wish all children could enjoy the support of a devoted parent, coach, teacher, or mentor.
Obviously, because I have a child in hockey, that's why I picked this one up. Our family is huge PK Subban lovers, supporters. So I think that's probably why I loved it so much. But I would recommend it just for parenting kind of thoughts in general. And then the last nonfiction is called Not That Bad. It's another one I don't own because I listened to the audiobook. But this is an essay mostly collection, and the authors actually, like, I don't remember if it's all of them, but I know that I was surprised by people narrating, like telling their own stories, reading their own essays in here.
Buying into the notion of Not That Bad made me incredibly hard on myself for not getting over it fast enough as the years passed, and I was still carrying so much hurt, so many memories.
So this is Dispatches from Rape Culture, and there are, I don't even know the number of different essays in here, but it's where they explore what it means to live in a world where women are frequently belittled and harassed due to their gender. I thought it was a really powerful collection in general. So those are currently my favorite audiobooks, ones that I would recommend to you. If you were planning on reading these books already, I suggest the audiobook. If you're just getting into audiobooks, here's some ones to try. Thank you very much for watching and giving any ideas, examples, suggestions. I will see you later. Bye.